welcome to this gender pay gap analysis video. Today, I'm going to be taking you through the gender pay gap analysis process. Broadly, the process I'm going to show you will mimic a very crucial step that employers will need to undertake to understand what's driving their gender pay gaps. Of course, this is also a crucial step for any organisation that wants to understand how to close their pay gaps. Sometimes, I'll be speaking to you like this. At other times, I'll be sharing my screen with you. If I've done my job well, at the end of this video, you should have a firm understanding of how to apply a gendered lens to your workplace data. Beyond that, you'll learn how to identify which data you'll need for an analysis, classify that data, investigate the data using 5 key questions for guidance, and then interpret the gendered trends. The structure of a pay gap analysis correlates to 5 simple questions that we want to ask our data. These questions are: number 1, what does the gender composition of your organisation look like? Number 2, what does the distribution of pay look like? Number 3, are there any gender differences in mobility? Number 4, what does your talent pool look like? And number 5, are there gender differences in employee patterns of engagement? If we can answer all 5 of these questions, we'll have a solid, data-driven foundation for an action plan to close our organisation-level gender pay gaps. To demonstrate an analysis today, I've produced a dummy data set. The organisation we'll be looking at today will be referred to as Example. Example is a very small bank with just under 200 employees. However, the same process can still apply for organisations with 500 or more employees. Before we begin looking at the data, I want to be clear that this example data set is not real, even at times if it does reflect what you would expect to see in the financial services industry. I also want to state that the data we'll be drawing on today is binary in nature. Only men and women, there are no non-binary employees at Example. The agency has recently started collecting non-binary data on a voluntary basis. But at this point in time, WGEA does not produce gender pay gaps for non-binary employees. However, it is something that the agency is working on. For more information, you can see the recent review of the Workplace Gender Equality Act. Okay, so let's jump into the data. Look, if you're familiar with the WGEA compliance reporting process, at first glance, you could be forgiven for thinking that you're looking at a unit-level workplace profile, just based on what you're seeing on your screen right now. And that's because the workplace profile actually isn't a bad starting point. It has a lot of the compulsory data points that we're going to want to look at to do the analysis. And in fact, all of these variables are collected in the workplace profile. So what you can see on your screen: employee ID, gender, graduate status, employment type, base salary, total remuneration or bonuses, and then manager, non-manager categories. However, if I scroll to the right, you're going to start seeing some data that doesn't appear in WGEA compliance reporting. So for example, we've got occupation title, job family, pay level or grouping, department or unit, and years since last promotion, and then we've got manager category. And if we continue to scroll to the right, we get some very, very distinct data. So we've got the number of direct reports, the gender of the manager, performance evaluation results, whether there's a flexible working arrangement in place, the year since the employee took parental leave, if they took parental leave, the type of parental leave that they took, and then finally some further identity characteristics such as year of birth, age, postcode, tenure, ethnicity, and qualification level. Additionally, we have data about appointments to the organisation, as well as shortlisting data and interview data. We have data from exit interviews, and we also have promotion data. So this is a really comprehensive data set, and by no means will every organisation have collected all of these data points. It's the full suite. We are showing you the full complement of data today so that you get a really good understanding of the kinds of insights you can get out of your data, and the deeper you go, the more you can get out.
An extremely important but simple tool that you can use to do high-level data analysis is a pivot table in Excel. Now, if you don't know how to build a pivot table, please don't be alarmed because I'm about to teach you and it isn't difficult. So what we're going to do when we're in Excel is begin by highlighting the data that we're going to use. In this case, we're going to calculate a gender pay gap. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight all of this white data right down to the bottom. I could go across and include the other variables, but I don't really need to at this point. But there's no harm, it will just give you more options. The second step is we're going to go up to Insert here from the top menu and click on this pivot table icon. And it gives us the option to build a table in a new worksheet or an existing worksheet. For this demonstration, I'll build one in a new worksheet. And you can see here a little table builder has popped up on a new worksheet. And on the right-hand side of the screen, we've got a list of many fields that we can use to build our pivot table. For this demonstration, I'm going to calculate a total remuneration gender pay gap for the entire workforce. So the fields I'm going to need are gender and total remuneration. Now, you'll notice over here we've got some rather large numbers, and immediately I can see it says sum of total remuneration. For a gender pay gap, you can either use the median or the average. So we don't want the sum of everyone's salaries. For this demonstration, I'm going to use the average. So I'm going to come down here to the values and I'm going to change it. So I'm going to value field settings. I'm going to change it from sum to average. Okay. So now we have the average salary in the organisation for women and men. You can get rid of the grand total. It's not necessary. All right. So that's very basically the foundation for building a pivot table. It's the same process again and again. But what I'm going to show you now involves using a very simple equation to calculate the gender pay gap. So we're going to start by taking the male salary and minusing the female salary and seeing whether there's a gap. So in Excel, whenever you're doing an equation, you're going to start off with the equal symbol. And I'm just going to grab that male salary, and then I'm going to minus the female salary, and then I'm going to hit enter. So we can see here that there is a gap of over $45,000. All right. The next thing we're going to do to get the gender pay gap is we're going to take this gap and then we're going to divide it by the male salary. And importantly, so that it comes out as a percentage, we're going to times it by 100 and hit enter. And there we have our total remuneration gender pay gap of 22.9%. That's it. So it's the same process for any gender pay gap you're calculating at any level of the organisation, and very similar for composition gaps as well.
Okay, so I just wanted to quickly speak about some of the language I'll be using to talk about pay gaps and composition today. When I'm referring to vertical pay gaps, I'm talking about the kind of pay gaps that have their roots in gender composition. So generally, what we see in Australia is a concentration of women in the lower paid roles at the lower end of the organisational hierarchy, and we see the reverse for men. And that's why at the start of this process, we're looking at composition data instead of going straight into pay gaps, because the two are very intrinsically linked. When I'm talking about horizontal gaps, I'm looking at gaps that happen at level. So it's not a straightforward matter of composition that can be resolved with, say, strategic recruitment, promotion, or succession planning practices. Horizontal pay gaps may be completely justifiable, doesn't mean unequal pay. But they are more likely to be linked to things like bias creeping into pay negotiation processes, for example. Okay, so now that we have that down, let's get into the data. If you think back to the first question on our list of 5, it was, what is the gender composition of the organisation? What does it look like? So we're going to look at a few metrics when we're looking at composition data, and those are the organisation's overall composition, the composition of the manager and non-manager groups, gender composition by pay grade, gender composition by job family, gender composition of the graduate cohort, and then the gender composition by employment status as well. To test the data using these metrics, we obviously are going to need some thresholds to understand, well, are there any hotspots? So we have established a number of thresholds. So in terms of the organisation's overall composition, we're going to be looking to see if any gender group is overrepresented, so exceeding 60%. So for the manager and non-manager category, you're going to see that there's a theme. Again, if any gender group is exceeding 60%, that is indicating that there is gender imbalance in terms of composition. And again, we're going to be looking at that 60% threshold for gender composition by pay grade, but we're particularly going to pay attention to the highest pay grade and the lowest pay grade, and that's because that feeds into the gender pay gap. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about how composition is linked to pay gaps shortly. And for gender composition by job family, we're going to look again at that 60% threshold. And we're also going to look and see whether any gender group is disproportionately represented across multiple job families. So looking at occupational segregation, men working in certain occupations in terms of job families, women working in certain job families. Then we're going to look at the gender composition of the graduate cohort, and we're simply looking to see whether there's any overrepresentation of one gender. And then in terms of gender composition by employment status, again, we're looking at that 60% threshold in any of the following categories, so full-time employees, part-time employees, or representation in casual work. Okay, so let's go and have a look at the composition data now.
Okay, so let's look at examples composition data. So if we look at the top line composition stats, we can see that the organisation is 76.2% male concentrated, with just 23.8% female representation. If we go down and look at a manager level, we can see that 80% of managers are male and 20% of managers are female. And if we go back to that top level stat, we can see that males are slightly overrepresented in management and females are slightly underrepresented in management. What we really want to find out is what proportion of the female cohort and what proportion of the male cohort are represented in management, because we know that there are a lot more men in management than there are women. If we go over and have a look at the proportional representation, we can see that 16.7% of the female cohort are represented in management, whereas 20.8% of the male cohort are represented in management, with a gap of 4.1 percentage points. The reason we want to understand the proportionate representation, as well as the overall composition, is because when it comes to intervention, you don't want to be setting targets for the wrong metric. So if we think about female-concentrated industries and organisations, what we tend to see is an overrepresentation of men in management, despite their smaller numbers in the workforce. Likewise, it's entirely possible for a female cohort to have higher proportional representation in management, even if men outnumber them in terms of sheer numbers within a male-concentrated organisation-like example. Now, that's not what's happening here, but it is possible. What it would mean is that we actually have a good pipeline into management for women, but we just don't have enough female talent. In the case of example, though, we have a problem on both fronts. So this tells me that we probably want to look at both recruitment and promotion practices. Okay, following the same logic for looking at gender balance across various pay grades, we can immediately see that men are outnumbering women in all pay grades, but remembering too that we just have a lot more men in example organisation. So if we then go to look at proportional representation, it tells a slightly different story. So the proportionate representation of men is slightly higher in the Tier 1 specialist cohort. So that's highly paid technical roles. And then we can see pretty high, disproportionately high representation in the Tier 2 specialist cohort. So again, these are technical roles in the middle pay range. What I'm looking at over here is the gap. So we've got a 6 percentage point gap in the Tier 1 specialist, and then a 13.4 percentage point gap in the Tier 2 specialist. We can also see a slight gap and overrepresentation of men in the top paid cohort, which is Tier 1 management. Interestingly, what we can see is that there's a huge gap in favour of women in Tier 3, which is the lowest paid pay grade. Interestingly, we have pretty much got balance at a few of the other levels. So the big takeaway, I suppose, is that we have an overrepresentation of men in these higher paid technical roles, and women are mostly concentrated in the lowest pay grade. And what we can probably take from this is that there are probably barriers for women to get into those higher paid roles. But at some levels, balancing the overall composition is just going to come down to introducing more female talent into the system to promote up the line. We can also see that men are just not proportionally represented at the lowest pay grade, and that's probably something that can be addressed through targeted recruitment. Okay, so moving down to the next metric, we're going to look at job families. Now, if you've got keen eyes, you'll see that we've got executive management in here with the rest of the some very common job families, and that's because executive management just didn't really fit easily elsewhere, and I wanted to include it in this analysis. So that may look different for your organization. You may do a breakdown of management categories instead. In this case, what I find really interesting about example organization is that men are outnumbering women across all job families, even in areas that even in a male concentrated organization, you might expect to see a little bit more gender balance or even higher female representation, such as marketing. The exception here is comms, which is the only job family where we have gender balance. Now, when it comes to gender representation, there's gender balance, but there's another important threshold, which is the critical mass threshold. So the research tells us that the critical mass threshold is about 30%. So that's when a group goes from feeling like a minority to feeling better represented within an organization. So I always like to look at that critical mass threshold first before looking to see whether we've got gender balance. And what I can see within this organization is that we haven't reached a critical mass in executive management, finance, IT, and sales for women. So that indicates that we have a lot of composition work to do broadly across the organisation. All right, moving a little bit further down, and we look at the composition by employment status. So that is for our casuals, full-time and part-time employees. And what we can see is that the majority of the workforce is working full-time. So that in and of itself is something to note for me. Often what we see in certain industries is a reliance on full-time workers. It's just the cultural norm. But that can be tied to ideas of the ideal worker archetype, where part-time workers can actually be disadvantaged because they're viewed as less career-oriented. In this case, we probably don't have a critical mass of part-time employees. We can see that only 9 women and 3 men work part-time. So that's 12 employees out of 202. And if we go over and look at proportional representation, we can see that 18.8% of women are represented in part-time work, whereas only 1.9% of men work part-time. So there's a large gap there. And we can see on the flip side that 97.4% of the male cohort work full-time and 81.3% of the female cohort work part-time. And there's only 1 employee that works casually in the entire organisation. So we can see some very gendered trends there. Women work part-time, men don't really work part-time. And that's another thing that I would be making a note of as a little hotspot that we would want to investigate further. Okay, moving down to some very granular data. The first thing I want to say about looking within a small organization at occupation data and data that is this granular is that we have to be a little bit careful. So in this case, I'm not going to look at any occupation data where we have a population that's less than 5 employees. It's really hard, even when we're looking at rough high-level trends, to pull out meaningful insights when the populational sample just isn't big enough. My very top line observation here is that we have a lot of 100% male representation, and that's because we actually have a lot of roles that are one-offs. So there's one person within this occupation group and it's more likely that it's going to be male. And of course that contributes to the vertical pay gap, so those top level pay gaps, and I'll talk more about how composition and pay are related soon. Again, when it comes to occupation groups, I would be prioritizing areas where the critical mass threshold of 30% has not been met. The complicating factor here is that we're looking at very small cohorts. What I can see here is that there is gender imbalance across most occupational groups, with a few exceptions. But I think what I would be doing here is just paying attention to where we have 100% male or female representation in any occupational group. Okay, moving down to look at the gender composition of the graduates. And what we can see straight off the bat is that we've got 50-50 representation. When we look at the proportional representation, we can see 8.3% of that female cohort are graduates. So that's actually a pretty high proportion. It's definitely a big gap with the male representation, which is 2.6%. So even though we've got a 50-50 split amongst graduates, which is fantastic, we can see that there's a higher proportion of the female cohort that are at that very junior level. It's not necessarily a bad thing, particularly for an organisation that's male concentrated. A really good lever, for example, to pull is to get more female graduates through the door, because then you have a lot of opportunity to develop that talent and promote it up the line. It's a long-term strategy, but it can be really effective if you're strategically looking at your composition gaps and recruiting at those lower levels with those gaps in mind for the future. All right, coming down to the last pivot table here, we've just got a breakdown of gender distribution by age. And if we look at the top level trends here, just a quick look, what we can actually see is that, well, of course, we've got more male representation because it's a very male concentrated organization. However, we've got a bit of a drop off in terms of female representation when we get to age 50 plus. Okay, so we've got, peaks and troughs here, but then when we get to 50 plus, we see a very marked drop in female representation, but you'll note that we don't see the same when it comes to men. So what's happening within an example organisation? Why are we not retaining our staff, our female staff who are 50 plus years of age? All right, that's it from composition data. I think we've pulled a few good insights here. Let's move on to our next question.
So if we can recall, the second question that we were asking our data was, what does the distribution of pay look like? And to find that out, we're going to look across the following metrics. So we're going to look at the organization's gender pay gap, both base salary and total remuneration. We're going to look at the gender pay gap for manager and also non-manager groups, the gender pay gap by pay grade, the gender pay gap by job family, the gender pay gap by occupation group, the gender pay gap for the graduate cohort, and then, of course, the gender pay gap by employment status as well. As before with composition, to find out whether we have any hotspots, we need to test the data against thresholds, and we've established a series of thresholds for pay gaps. There's going to be another theme with pay gaps, and that's generally going to be a 5% tolerance threshold. So if we're looking at the overall total remuneration or base salary gender pay gap, we're going to pay attention if the pay gap exceeds 5% in either direction. So there's a pay gap that's larger than 5%, or on the other end, larger than minus 5%, so a pay gap in favor of women. We also want to see whether the total remuneration gender pay gap is substantially higher than the base salary gender pay gap, because that gives us an idea whether or not discretionary pay is one of the main drivers of your overall gender pay gap. As for the overall gender pay gaps, we're going to have a 5% tolerance threshold for both manager and non-manager pay gaps. And it's going to be the same for pay grades. But again, we're going to pay particular attention to the highest and the lowest pay grades because we know that those contribute greatly to the overall gender pay gap. For job family, again, it's going to be a tolerance threshold of 5%, and same with occupation. I'll talk a little bit later about it more when we look at the data, but when we get lower, more granular with the data, when we're talking about job, family, or occupation, we do, of course, have to be really careful that we're not talking about instances of unequal pay. So we always have to be checking, are these pay gaps justifiable, or are they instances of unequal pay, which, of course, legally must be remediated immediately. Again, we're going to look and see if there's any gender pay gap present in the graduate cohort. I'll talk about it a little bit more when we look at the data, but we're not setting a 5% tolerance threshold for the graduates. And then for employment status, again, it's a tolerance threshold of 5% for your full-time, part-time, or casual employee groups. Okay, so let's look at the data again.
Okay, so let's have a look at example organisations' pay data now. So immediately what we can see when we look at the gender pay gaps for base salary and total remuneration is that both are well above the 5% tolerance threshold. Now, important to note here that we're looking at average base salary and average total remuneration. You can also look at the median. It completely depends on what's most appropriate for your organisation. If you report to the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, we're going to be publishing both your median and your average gender pay gaps. What's important to note, and what I always look for, is whether the total remuneration gender pay gap is significantly larger than the base salary. If it is larger than the base salary, that usually means that a lot of what's contributing to your gender pay gap, or a lot of issues, can be found in your discretionary pay framework. So, for example, your bonuses might be contributing a lot to your total rem gap. Because we've got a large base salary gap in this case, I'm not super concerned about the discretionary pay framework. There is a little bit of a gap, and it is something that I would probably investigate. But what I can see is that there's a large base salary gap, and that says to me that there's something else going on. So I would need to review the entire remuneration framework. Now, given that I've already looked at the composition data, I think we have a fairly good idea already of what's going on and what might be driving that base salary gap. If you think back to the composition of our pay bands and where we saw male representation and where we saw female representation, and we think about this as being a vertical pay gap, so what's contributing up the line to these high-level pay gaps, we saw higher representation of men in those higher pay grades, didn't we? And women were more represented in the lowest pay grade. So that indicates to me that composition is playing a large role in our top-level pay gaps. But we're not going to just stop there. We're going to drill down further into our data to try to understand what's really going on under the surface. So if we move down to pay grades by manager or non-manager status, immediately we can see that there's a larger pay gap at the manager level than there is at the non-manager level, although both are significant gender pay gaps. This is pretty consistent with what we see across the workforce in every industry. It seems to be that the higher up in the organisational hierarchy and the more money employees are receiving, the wider the gender pay gap. So that gives us some more information about where we might want to focus our attention if we were looking at closing gender pay gaps. However, there are still pieces of the puzzle missing, so let's go a bit deeper. If we come down to the gender pay gap by pay grade, and remembering that this is very closely related to the composition gaps that we were seeing, If we look at our top tier for pay, we can see that there's a gender pay gap in favour of men in the very top level of 27.4%. But if we look at that tier 1 specialist level, there's a gap of 42.5%. Now, remembering back to the composition, we saw that men were much more represented in tier 1 specialist roles when compared with women, weren't they? So having such a huge gender pay gap at this level is probably also contributing to that vertical pay gap. So if you remember, we've got horizontal pay gaps. So that's what we're looking at here, the gaps that are happening at level, which contribute to that vertical pay gap. So that top level pay gaps, it all flows up the line to the top level pay gaps. Interestingly, we've got some pay gaps in favour of women. So at the tier 2 management, tier 2 specialist, and the lowest tier 3 levels. But then we've got a couple of significant pay gaps in favour of men, and these are slightly higher paid in terms of the tier 2 and the tier 3 management. So it's a bit of a mixed bag here, but what we can see is that these really large pay gaps at the top pay grades are probably really contributing to those overall gender pay gaps. All right, let's move down to job family and get another piece of the puzzle. So I can see already that we've got quite a few large gender pay gaps here, with only one gender pay gap in favour of women, which is in marketing, and it is within our tolerance threshold, however. The rest of the gender pay gaps are not. But what I'm really paying attention to is this 72.9% gender pay gap within the C-suite. So again, that's reinforcing this picture that we started to see play out when we looked at the composition data, which is that it's at the top level of the organisation that the pay gaps are really, really large. This is exacerbated by an overrepresentation of women in the lower paid roles. We also have a significant gender pay gap in comms. If you'll remember, there was gender balance in that job family, so I would definitely be looking there to find out what's going on. Again, there are also some significant pay gaps in finance, IT, and sales, and also a decent pay gap in ops and admin. So plenty to look at here when we look at job families. All right, let's dig down another level. Let's look at the graduate cohort now. So remembering that there was 50-50 representation among the graduate cohort, we can see a 7.1% gender pay gap in favour of men. Now that is greater than the tolerance threshold, but I would also say that when it comes to the graduate cohort, I would always investigate any gender pay gap, even if it's under the tolerance threshold. Graduates are at that point in their careers which should be the most level playing field. Now, there may be perfectly legal reasons that you're paying graduates different amounts across the organisation. For example, you might be paying IT grads a higher salary than your comms grads because of market rates. However, I would always urge any organisation to really do an assessment of the skills that are involved in each job and think about the long-term impacts of starting grads off at higher salaries, because we know that that's going to continue to play out throughout their careers. So again, not necessarily anything unlawful here, but I would be recommending to example that they take a good look at the graduate gender pay gap and think about whether it's really justifiable. So let's move down to our most granular data. You're going to see a lot of NAs here, and that's simply because we were unable to calculate a gender pay gap because the occupation group was either fully male or fully female. And in this example organisation's case, mostly fully male. That doesn't mean that their salaries are not contributing vertically, though. We just can't calculate a horizontal gap. But some of these really high salaries that are fully male concentrated are definitely contributing to that larger gender pay gap at the top level. So across the board, we can see some pretty high gender pay gaps. There's actually one that's in favour of women, but mostly we've got some large pay gaps that are in favour of men. Oh, there's another really high one in favour of women. But this, if we were looking at an occupation level, this gives us some direction to see, okay, well, actually, what's going on with these horizontal gaps at this very granular level. Important to note, thinking back to our composition data, what we know about the large pay gaps happening at those really high paid levels, you might close these horizontal gender pay gaps and not see a huge amount of traction on your overall gender pay gap. Collectively, if you close all of the gaps, you're probably likely to see some action. But in some of the lower paid occupation groups, it's not going to have as much of an impact as, say, for example, making good progress on that pay gap in your C-suite. That does not mean that it's not the right thing to do. Where we see significant pay gaps across all of these occupational groups, I would be recommending, to example, that they double check that there's no unequal pay happening, that they do a proper investigation. This might involve gender inclusive job analysis, or just really going through and looking at the data at a unit level and paying attention to those gendered trends. All right, if we move down to look at GPG by staff level, we can see that there is a large gender pay gap at that executive leader level. So again, that speaks to what we've already identified. There's actually a large gender pay gap in favour of women at a manager level, significant gender pay gaps in favour of men at a non-manager and team leader level. You might be starting to think, well, if there's a gender pay gap in favour of women at a manager level, isn't that counteracting what's happening at an executive leader level? And you're absolutely correct, it is. What's important is to go and have a look at the salaries. So we can see that female managers are paid roughly half of what the average male executive leader. So it's those really large salaries that are having a really large skewing effect on your gender pay gaps. So again, this reinforces the notion that if example want to make good traction on the gender pay gaps, they really need to pay attention to what's happening at that top end. And I would also say pay attention to the concentration of women in those lower paid roles. All right, moving down to our next table, we can see the distribution of pay by gender across the organisation. So this shows us that most staff within the organisation are actually in the lower half in terms of pay grades. But if we look at the second half, we see a small amount of female representation, but it's mostly male representation in these really high paid roles, isn't it? Okay, moving down to our last table, which is gender pay gap by employment status, so casual, full-time and part-time. We've got one male casual, so that's not really a gender pay gap there, but what we can, but certainly it contributes. What we can see is that there's a gender pay gap in favour of men for both full-time and part-time staff. Now that's really interesting. At a national level, when we look at part-time data, there's usually a small pay gap in favour of women, keeping in mind that women are far more likely to work part-time. However, we can also see that there's a significant gender pay gap that broadly reflects the overall organisational gender pay gap in favour of men. So I would definitely be asking myself the question, why are part-time men attracting a much higher salary than part-time women? So that gives us just another line of inquiry. Okay, that's it for the pay data. Let's move on to the next question.
Okay, so returning to our third question, that was, are there gender differences in mobility? And as usual, we've got a series of metrics that we're going to look at. So those are gender composition of promotions, promotion rate by gender, proportion of gender cohort promoted, promotion rate from non-management to management by gender, the proportion of the gender cohort promoted into management, the gender composition of resignations by pay grade, department or unit, job, family, and occupation group, the turnover rate by gender, and then the proportion of the gender cohort that has resigned. You'll notice that again, we're talking about the kind of overall figures, but also the proportion. So the proportion within the larger cohorts. So, for example, the proportion of women that are promoted to management is going to look different when we're looking at just that female talent pool rather than overall how many promotions went to men or to women. Okay, so as always, to test the data, we need to establish the thresholds to identify hotspots, and so we've done that for you. And when we're looking at the gender composition of promotions, we're just looking to see whether one gender has received a higher total rate of promotions. So that's going to be our first clue. But we're also going to look at the promotion rate. So who is being promoted at a higher rate? Because if you've got a large number of men in an organization and a small number of women, the total rate of promotions might be higher for men, but the rate of promotion might actually be higher for women. That's something we want to find out. The proportion of gender cohort promoted. So again, we're going to see whether any gender is being promoted at a disproportionately higher rate, proportionate to the overall composition. So we're not looking at the flat numbers as we were in the first metric. We're looking at the proportions of those individual cohorts. So what proportion of men were promoted into management? What proportion of female were promoted into management as a proportion of their cohort? So we want to look at the whole figures of who was, in terms of promotions from non-management to management, what was the composition of that, what proportion went to men, what proportion went to women overall, but then looking proportionate to each cohort as well. So what proportion of women out of that cohort, if there's a smaller number of women in the workforce, this is why it's important, or a larger number of women, we need to find out what proportion of that cohort has been promoted, because that's also very telling. We want to look at the gender composition of resignations by those, and we're going to cut it by those different groups of pay grade, departmental unit, etc. And what we want to know is any gender group disproportionately resigning from any of those groups? And then we're going to look at the turnover rate by gender. So again, if we've got a huge number of male employees and a small number of women, you're going to see higher resignation rates across the board for men because there are just simply more men resigning. But what we want to do is find out what the turnover rate is. So is that higher for men or for women? And finally, we're going to look at the proportion of the gender cohort that's resigned. So proportionally of those women, of those men, what does that look like? What proportion of women have resigned in a period of time? What proportion of men have resigned in a period of time? And that is also telling because it tells us how much of the workforce by gender we've actually lost. Okay, so let's go and have a look at the data. Okay, so now it's time to take a look at our mobility data. So if we remember the metrics, we're looking at resignations and promotions to management. And the first one we're going to look at is our turnover rate. So overall, the turnover rate for all employees is 14.9%. Then if we look at our resignation rates down here, so by gender, our turnover rate, the turnover rate for women is 31.3%, whereas for men it's 9.7%. So that's more than 3 times the turnover rate for women. Huge hotspot right there that I would be paying attention to. Why are women resigning from example organisation at a faster rate than men? We can already see here that 50% of the resignations were from women, but we also know that women are very, very underrepresented in terms of the total gender composition. So in terms of promotions, we can see that there were 42 promotions in total. 36 of them went to men, 6 of them went to women. So the composition was 85.7% of promotions went to males. If we look at that in terms of the promotion rate for each cohort, women are being promoted at about 12.5%, men at about 23.4%. And what that means is roughly almost twice the rate men are being promoted when compared with women. So again, another hotspot. Women are leaving the organizations faster and they're not being promoted as fast as men. What's going on? If we go down to promotions from non-management into management, which we know from the research is a huge barrier for a lot of women in particular, we can see that there were 26 promotions in total and that Of these promotions, 92.3% went to men, whereas 7.7% were female promotions. So again, men very disproportionately represented, indicating that the same thing is happening at example, that women are finding it harder to jump from non-management and into management. If we look at gender composition of promotions by job family, we can see that there were 42 promotions in total, and that most of the promotions happened within sales and finance, the majority, of course, going to males, with the exception being in an IT where a single female was promoted. And then if we come down to resignations by manager and non-manager cohort, we can see that of all of the resignations, then there were 30, 25 were in the non-manager cohort, 5 were in the manager cohort. So we lost 3 male managers, 2 female managers, 13 female non-managers and 12 male non-managers. So in terms of the composition, 40% of manager resignations were female and 52% of non-manager resignations were female. So what that means is that women have been really overrepresented in resignations just across the board, but also in those two categories. And then moving down to look at resignations by occupation group. Is there a particular occupation where we're seeing a lot of resignations? The answer is yes. Within the sales associate cohort, we had 9 resignations, and actually most of them were female. Now, if we think back to our composition data, I think sales associate, that is one of the larger cohorts, and it had larger proportionate female representation. However, that is still something that I would be looking at. Why have we got a lot of people resigning from this particular occupation group? And that's followed by loan officers. But these are really small numbers. I mean, we're dealing with a small number of resignations, but it is a small organization. So, 30 resignations for an organization of 200 is actually, as we know, 14.9% turnover rate. That's not insignificant. So from this, I would take that women are overrepresented in resignations and underrepresented in promotions, and that is definitely something that we need to have a much closer look at. Okay, so this brings us to our 4th question. What does your talent pool look like? Again, we've got a series of metrics that we're going to look at to get insights from our data. And of course, we're going to look at the thresholds after that. But beginning with the metrics, we have gender of job applicants, gender composition of shortlisted candidates, gender composition of interviewed candidates, and appointments by gender. Okay, in terms of how we test the data and the thresholds, for gender of job applicants, we're looking to see if there's a higher proportion of any gender group among job applicants. And then the same again for shortlisted candidates. And you guessed it, the same again for interviewed candidates. And finally, same again for appointments. So we really just want to know who's being attracted to the organization, who's being shortlisted, who makes it through to interview, and then finally, who's appointed. What we want to discover is it possible that there are any gendered trends, any room for biases to be slipping into the recruitment process? Okay, let's have a look at the data. Okay, so now moving on to look at our talent pool data. So what we really want to find out is, who are we attracting to the organization? Who are we actually interviewing? And who are we hiring? So we've got gender disaggregated data here. And the first thing that we're going to look at is the number of appointments. So we could see that the recent appointments, 68.3% of them were male and 31.7% of them were female. So obviously this is contributing to our overall composition gap within the organisation being very male concentrated, and potentially contributing to our gender pay gaps as well. If we go and have a look at the gender of the job applicants, this is very telling, because this is telling us who is actually attracted to the organisation. And we can see that there was a grand total of 63 applications. 20 of them were from women, 43 were from men, meaning only 31.7% of applicants were women, 68.3% were men, so more than twice as many male applicants to roles at example organisation. Big hotspot there. Certainly something that there are a lot of actions that you could attach to that to try and change that. But again, we're not going to go into that in this video. If we look at the gender composition of our shortlisted candidates, we can see that of the applicants then that were then shortlisted, we had 9 females, 23 males, so a total of 32. And composition-wise, that was 28.1% female and 71.9% male. So we can see that talent pool, that female talent pool, shrinking. So men were just coming through to the shortlist at a higher rate. So 53.5% of the male applicants got through to shortlisting, whereas only 45% of the females. And then if we actually look at who was interviewed, we can see that 21 of the applicants were actually interviewed. 5 of them were female, 16 of them were male. So that's 76.2% male, 23.8% female. And if we look at the proportion of those shortlisted candidates that then made it through to interview, 25% were female and 37.2% were male. So yet again, that pool of females shrinks again. So what we can see here is that at every stage of the attraction and recruitment process, men were getting through at higher rates than women were. And that is a big question mark. That is a hot spot. Why is this happening? What is happening within example organization? Why are they not attracting as many women to these jobs? Why are women not getting through at the same rates as men? Very, very tangible actions that can be taken as a result of these insights. But for now, we're going to move on to our next question. Right. So this brings us to our final question. Are there gender differences in employee patterns of engagement? So again, there are a series of metrics that we're going to be looking at. This one gets down into some really granular data that organisations may or may not be capturing, but the metrics are as follows. Gender by parental leave utilisation, gender composition of resignations and years since parental leave was taken, gender by flexible working arrangement utilisation, gender composition of resignations and utilisation of flexible working arrangements, gender by performance evaluation gradings, and finally, gender by reason for leaving the organisation, which we would get from exit interview data. Okay, so again, to test the data, we need some thresholds, and we've established those. So in terms of parental leave utilisation, what we want to look for is whether any one gender group is using primary or secondary carers, whatever makes sense for your organisation, at a higher rate. So with about a 5% tolerance threshold, but essentially we want to know, are more women taking primary carers leave, which is usually the case, more men taking secondary carers leave. We just need that data so that we can make informed decisions. We want to look at the composition of resignations and years since parental leave, because we know that from the research that that can be linked. So we want to see, are there any gender trends that seem to be appearing in our data? Are employees that have recently utilised parental leave more likely to resign? And we're looking, again, we've got about a 5% tolerance threshold there. In terms of gender by flexible working arrangement utilisation, we want to see, is there a higher proportion of any gender group utilising flex? The research indicates that women are probably more likely to utilise flex, but we want to see, is that playing out in your data? Again, then, in terms of resignations and flex, the research indicates that there could be a connection there between employees that are more likely to utilise flex and those more likely to resign. So we want to see, is any trend appearing in your data? Are employees utilising flex more likely to leave your organisation or less likely to leave your organisation? And we want to see, we'll have about a 5% tolerance threshold there as well. In terms of gender by performance evaluation grading, we know from the research that there are gender trends that correlate to higher performance ratings. The research generally indicates that men receive higher performance gradings, but we want to test that within your data, again with a 5% tolerance threshold. And gender by reason for leaving the organisation. So we would want to do some coding here of your exit interview data and bring that down to the key reasons employees are stating or articulating when they leave the organization. Then we want to look at that with a gendered lens on and kind of recognize whether there are trends there. Are women leaving for a common reason? Are men leaving for a common reason? And non-binary employees leaving for a common reason? Okay, so one last time, let's dive into the data. Okay, so finally, let's have a look at our most granular data, which is our patterns of engagement data. What we're going to look at here is utilization of benefits like parental leave and flexibility, and see if we can identify any gendered trends. So straight off the bat, the first metric we're looking at is the type of parental leave taken by gender and the year since it was taken. And we can see immediately, if we expand this column, this is primary carers leave and secondary carers leave. So a lot of organisations make a distinction between primary and secondary carers leave. That is not leading practice. Our leading practice employers are definitely moving more towards a gender neutral or gender equal parental leave, where there's no distinction between who's a primary carer and who's a secondary carer. And it's been very successful. Everyone has access to the same amount of leave because everybody is considered to be an equal parent and therefore responsible for a new child that comes into their home. And we just get away with this idea that someone is the primary parent and someone is the secondary parent. So what we can see is that in example organisation, they're a bit behind the times here in that every employee that took primary carers leave was female. Every employee that took secondary carers leave was male. I mean, these are the broad patterns that we see throughout the Australian workforce, but we're hoping that this is going to change. When it comes to resignations by gender and year since parental leave, what we're looking for, we want to see if there's a correlation between taking parental leave and leaving the organisation and resigning. Now, again, there's a very small cohort here. There's 15 employees that took parental leave in total. 30 who took parental leave in total, so 15 women and 15 men. So of those employees that took parental leave, 66.7% of the female cohort actually ended up resigning within 2 years of taking parental leave, and only 26.7% of the male employees who took parental leave ended up resigning, and that was spread out more across the years. But what that does tell me is that there probably is a gendered correlation, at least, between parental leave and resignation. So women just aren't returning to work and staying at work in the same way that men are after parental leave. But in both cases, it's a very well-known time where talent leaves the organisation. It's a big life-changing event, and suddenly there's a lot to balance. So it is certainly a hotspot that I would be investigating more deeply if I was example organisation. Now, we're going to look at the gender utilisation of flexible working arrangements. So there's various types of flexible working included here. We can see that in total there are 202 staff utilising flex. As a proportion of their cohort, because again, we're looking at proportional representation, there's way more men using flex than there are women, but that's because there are way more male employees in the organisation. So when we look at proportional representation, actually 64.6% of female employees use flex, and only 18.8% of men do. So there's a big gender difference there. Again, big hotspot. What's stopping men from utilising flex? If we keep scrolling down, we want to have a look and see if there's any kind of correlation between the use of flex and resignation. Now, flex is often said to be something that counters resignation, but let's just have a look and see whether we can identify any gendered trends. So if we go and have a look, let's just look at this table, use of flex among resigned staff. Of the female staff that resigned, 13 of them had used flex and 2 hadn't, whereas only 3 men had used flex and 12 had not. 64.6% of women utilise flex. It seems that a higher proportion of women using flex resigned, and probably about spot on for men that are using flex, given that it was nearly 19%. But I mean, this one is not really sending up huge red flags for me at this point. So let's go down to the next one, gender by performance grading. So we can see we've got these different performance grades from exceeds expectations down to needs improvement. In terms of this top performance grading, men are kind of proportionally overrepresented in that top category. So only 35.4% of the female cohort get that top performance grading, whereas 41.1% of the men did. When it comes to the lowest performance grading, 20.8% of the female cohort got the lowest. Only 1.3% of the male cohort got the lowest grading. And then if we look at the second lowest grading, 43.8% of the women got that, 45.7% of the men. So there's a small gap there, but it's pretty much on par. But what is concerning is that we have a difference, a significant enough difference in the top grading and quite a difference. Women are obviously much more likely to be rated as needs improvement. And that, to me, is a bit of a hot spot, something that we would want to look at. And then coming down to our last metric, which is gender by articulated reason for leaving the organization. So this has come from exit interview data. We can see that of the 30 resignations, women were most likely to resign because of family responsibilities, whereas men were most likely to resign because they were seeking development opportunities. I think that is, again, we're not dealing with a huge amount of people, but that is pretty telling in and of itself. Exit data, I mean, we have to be a little bit careful. It's a very heightened stage when employees are leaving the organization. But I think we can see some very gendered trends there, that women are more likely to say they're leaving because they can't balance family responsibilities, whereas that none of the men who resigned said that. And men are saying they're seeking better development opportunities, both of which are things that can be worked on, but certainly something I would be keeping a very close eye on. So another hot spot there. Okay, that's it from our patterns of engagement data. Okay, so I know that this has been a lot of information. What I'm going to do now is just recap some of the key findings across the 5 questions that we asked our data. So the first question had to do with the composition of the organisation. And what we found was that example organisation is very male concentrated. So 76.7% of all staff were men. This carried on through to the management categories. So men were disproportionately represented in management. 82.5% of managers were male. In terms of pay grades, what we found was that men outnumbered women in every pay grade because there were just way more of them, but proportionally they were more highly represented in the top pay grades, whereas women were more likely to be represented in the lower pay grades. In terms of job families, we found that men outnumbered women across the board again. Women had not met that 30% critical mass threshold in some of the key job families, including finance, IT, and sales. And then again, women hadn't reached that 30% critical mass threshold in some of the management categories as well, including senior management and executive management. The next question we had to ask was what the distribution of pay looked like within the organisation. What we found was that there was a base salary gender pay gap in favour of men of 23.4% and a total remuneration gender pay gap of 24.8%. So only a little difference there. We found that men were disproportionately represented in the higher paid management and technical roles, also represented at the top of their pay bands, even at level. There was a very large pay gap in executive management, as well as some noteworthy gaps in sales, operations, and finance. There were also gender pay gaps happening across several occupation groups, but notably in the sales associates, also for financial analysts, credit analysts, and cybersecurity analysts. There were many occupation groups that were entirely dominated by males, and many of them were higher paid. So that contributes to that vertical overall organisation gender pay gap. We also found that there was a small but significant gender pay gap within the graduate cohort. Okay, so the third question was about mobility. And what we found was that men were being promoted at roughly twice the rate of women, and women were resigning at about 3 times the rate of men. So some big, big hotspots there. We also found that there was a big barrier for women when it came to going from non-management to management. They were very underrepresented in promotions there. So the fourth question was about the talent pool. And what we found was that men were more than twice as likely to apply for a job at example organisation, and then they were 2.5 times more likely to be shortlisted. After that, men were 3 times as likely to be interviewed, and then they were appointed to example at more than twice the rate of women. So at every point of that attraction and recruitment process, the talent pool of women was shrinking. And the last question that we asked was about employee patterns of engagement. So what we found was that women were exclusively utilising primary carers leave, whereas men exclusively utilised secondary carers leave. We found that a high proportion of women who had resigned had utilised parental leave in the previous 2 years. And we also found that flexibility was disproportionately utilised by female staff. So the majority of women were using flex, whereas the majority of men were not. We found that women were disproportionately represented in the lowest performance grading category, and men were slightly overrepresented in the highest performance grading category. Finally, we found that most women who resigned reported that it was due to family or caring commitments, whereas men reported that it was due to a lack of career development opportunities. And that's it. That's a summary of the key findings and hotspots that we identified within examples data. So you may have picked up some more insights as we went through the data, but I think we'll leave it there. I know we've covered a huge amount of ground today, and a lot of it has been quite technical, but I hope you've been able to follow along and that this video has been helpful for you. I'll leave you with a reminder that there's a guide to doing a gender pay gap analysis available on our website. WGEA will also be running more masterclasses on topics related to gender pay gap analysis, such as understanding gender composition or undertaking action planning. Thank you for watching, and all the best with understanding your gender pay gaps.